one thing in common. They both wanted a baby girl.
I was really looking forward to having my family.
When I got pregnant again, I'm like, okay, this better be a girl.
And in September of 2006, each woman would get her wish. A beautiful newborn.
The baby's grandmother was so excited. She put a big sign out in front of the house.
But that's where the two women's paths both met and diverged. Because while one would have her baby through a difficult delivery,
she had a C-section, so, she was healing from the stitches.
The other would resort to more desperate measures.
She came out brandishing a knife and a gun.
And she said, I want your baby girl.
It was 20 till 1 on the afternoon of September 15th, 2006, when a frantic call came into the Franklin County, Missouri 911 center.
And what's the problem? This lady just came in and said somebody stole the baby. Someone stole her baby? Yes.
And the mother, according to the 911 call, had no clue as to the kidnapper's identity.
I have no idea who stole your baby. I know she was some stranger. She broke in my house.
The call kicked off a massive search for the missing infant.
National Guard came in, the FBI came in. We had volunteers from all over searching the woods.
And the story captured the nation's attention.
When you hear that it's a newborn that's missing, everybody wants to have a happy ending.
But while America hoped and prayed, police struggled with two questions. Was the distraught mother telling the truth?
There were some things at the crime scene that didn't really make sense. It kind of made us question some of the veracity of her statements.
And would police find the child in time?
Well, everyone feared that perhaps he was dead.
In the summer of 2006, 21-year-old Stephanie Woods and her husband James were preparing to welcome a new baby. It would be the high school sweetheart's second child. Son Connor was still in diapers.
I wanted a girl the first time, and then it ended up being a boy, and when I got pregnant again, I'm like, okay, this better be a girl.
On September 8, 2006, she went into labor at St. John's Mercy Hospital in the nearby town of Washington. After a cesarean delivery, she got the news she'd been hoping for. It was a girl. As Stephanie recovered in the hospital, her mother, Raylene, readied James and Stephanie's house for the homecoming of her new granddaughter, Abby.
Raylene was so excited that she put a big sign out in front of the house like so many of us.
While Stephanie was also thrilled to finally have the baby girl she always wanted, she still faced several weeks of recovery from the birth.
She had had a C-section. She was still very uncomfortable, wasn't back to normal.
She was sore and a little crabby, but she's a tough girl.
And that September, the entire nation would learn just how tough Stephanie Woods was. 7 days after the birth of her daughter, Stephanie Woods was gradually making the difficult adjustment to mother of two.
Even though it's only a week in at this point, we had a routine that, we had to do. When the baby's hungry, the baby's hungry, it's gonna eat.
James was at work. Connor was in his playpen. And week-old Abby had just fallen asleep in the crib when Stephanie laid down to grab a quick nap.
I was tired, but I think the adrenaline of a new baby will kind of keep you going, even if you're, you haven't seen sleep in a month.
Stephanie had barely drifted off when a woman she'd never seen before walked through the front door.
She was halfway in before Stephanie realized what was happening.
When you're caught off guard, as I was at that point, I just was kind of looking for, what do you want? What can I help you with?
The woman said her car had broken down and asked to use the phone.
She handed the woman the phone, and then the woman said that she needed to use the bathroom. And so the woman went into the bathroom.
But when she re-emerged a few minutes later, she was no longer holding the phone.
She came out brandishing a knife and a gun.
And that's when the woman waving the gun revealed the real reason she'd come barging into Stephanie's living room.
She told Stephanie, I'm here for your baby girl. And those are the words that Stephanie will never, ever forget.
The woman was after 7-day-old baby Abby, the little girl that Stephanie had always wanted.
Obviously, Stephanie didn't want to have anything to do with that, and there was quite a struggle.
It wasn't exactly a fair fight.
Stephanie just had a C-section, and so she was recovering from the stitches.
She, I'm sure, shouldn't have been very physically strong at that time.
And while the assailant was armed, she never fired the gun. She did, however, use her knife.
Stephanie was stabbed above her left breast. She was stabbed in the back. She had defensive wounds on her hand. Her thumb was almost severed.
1-year-old Connor witnessed the entire attack.
He saw things that he should have never had to see at his age.
Overpowering Stephanie, the woman with the knife forced her into a chair. Then, after tying Stephanie up, the woman took the knife and slashed the struggling mother's throat. Stephanie Woods wasn't about to give up, however.
All you got to do is put yourself in that position. You know, imagine that you've got a 5-day-old child at home and somebody comes by and snatches that child from you.
Stephanie freed herself from the chair and grabbed a knife from the kitchen table. But the woman overpowered her and choked her until she passed out. Then she grabbed Stephanie and Connor and shoved them into the bathroom.
She locked her in the bathroom and took the baby, leaving the little boy in the house alone with the mom passed out.
Perhaps 20 minutes passed before Stephanie regained consciousness. Connor's crying woke her.
He had blood on him. So for me, I didn't even really look at my injuries. I mean, I could feel the pain, but it was more on him. Is he okay?
The toddler was unhurt. But what about the baby?
And then it hit me, Abby's not here.
She was gone, taken by the woman with the knife. Not only that, the kidnapper had also taken the phone. Stephanie realized there was only one thing to do. She picked up her screaming son and stumbled out the door.
She managed to carry Connor from her house to the next neighbor's house, which was not immediately next door.
It was a miracle that she didn't bleed out as she was running the long distance away to the house to get help.
Although according to Stephanie, there was nothing miraculous about it.
I'm a mom. I mean, that's as simple as it is. I needed that other part of me, which was her.
And she was going to get help for her children, whatever it took.
She walked up the road barefoot. It's a gravel road.
She's the strongest person I know in this world. She had a baby, cesarean. She had her throat cut. She was stabbed in the back. And my daughter found the strength to walk probably the length of 3 football fields to safety. And if that ain't strength, I don't know nobody that can do that.
The neighbor dialed 911.
911, what's the emergency?
This lady just came in and said somebody stole the baby.
Someone stole her baby?
Yes.
Then, with sheriff's deputies and an ambulance on the way, Stephanie took the phone and made a desperate plea.
I just need somebody to find. Okay, ma'am. We've got people coming.
Among the first at the scene, Deputy Matt Corbett drove straight to the Woods' residence.
Missouri State Highway Patrolman had arrived at her location, so we knew there was somebody with her.
Entering the blood-spattered living room, Corbett confirmed that the kidnapper and baby Abby were long gone. But where?
Highway 47 runs in front of the victim's residence. That's a state highway, and somebody could have just been going through and grabbed the child and took off.
Was it a random kidnapping? And if so, how did Stephanie's attacker know she had an infant at home?
There was a sign in Stephanie's front yard welcoming the new baby.
Meanwhile, at the neighbor's house, detectives questioned Stephanie while EMTs struggled to save her life.
Lieutenant Detective Subkey was getting an interview with her literally in the back of the ambulance.
I got a brief description of what happened because the ambulance was really wanting to get her out.
And the crying toddler Stephanie still clutched in her arms further complicated the interview.
He wouldn't have anything to do with any of the cops. He was scared of them.
I'm sure he was pretty shaken up considering what he had witnessed.
Stephanie was also shaken up.
I remember being upset and crying, but I was more just in kind of a state of shock because I was like, okay, this is happening to us. We are going through this.
But what exactly had happened? All she could give the investigators was a short summary of the kidnapping and a vague description of her knife-wielding attacker.
She described her as a white female, heavy-set, long, dark hair, had a bowl cap, approximate age between 30s to 40s.
When Stephanie's mother, Raylene, arrived on the scene, she did what she could to comfort her daughter.
I just wanted to reassure her we were getting her back. Matter of fact, I pretty much promised and guaranteed we were going to get her back. But she seemed pretty desperate and confused.
Suffering multiple stab wounds, she was also in grave physical danger. Not long after Raylene arrived, a medevac helicopter was hovering overhead, summoned by the EMTs on the scene, who feared Stephanie wouldn't survive a long drive. Quickly transferred to the chopper, Stephanie was airlifted to St. John's Mercy in Washington, Missouri, the same hospital where she had given birth to baby Abby a week earlier.
I remember being upset and crying, but I was more just in kind of a state of shock because I was like, what now? What next?
Back at the crime scene, Sheriff Gary Tolke was thinking ahead too. As the helicopter disappeared over the horizon, he turned to Stephanie's mother with an urgent request.
They had asked if we had a recent photo, and it dawned on me, well, yeah, I got lots of them. I'm with Grandma.
It was the first lucky break in the investigation. Raylene's pictures revealed what could be the crucial piece of information in the hunt for baby Abby.
Baby Abby was born with a little strawberry mark on her forehead, a little stamp on her forehead.
The birthmark did help a lot because it was something identifiable. At that age, you know, babies change so quickly.
The Franklin County Sheriff's Department immediately issued an Amber Alert for baby Abby. And by 6 o'clock that evening, the abduction was the lead story on every local newscast.
When he was told by Sheriff Tolke to try to get on the news, he felt that that was pretty important.
Help.
Yeah. Help.
And if you're the one that done it, please bring her back. We don't have no issues with you. We just want her back.
Coming up, will a family's anguish turn to anger?
You're trained that in these type cases, family members are usually your first suspect.
And will the distraction allow the real kidnapper's trail to turn cold?
It's my baby.
By the early evening of September 15, 2006, police cars and camera crews surrounded the rural Missouri home of Stephanie and James Woods.
It was a huge response. There were police officers, federal investigators, and then also television stations and newspapers and radio stations were also there.
Following standard procedures, the Franklin County Sheriff's Department had issued an Amber Alert, and baby Abby's family had even made a desperate plea on the evening news.
I think they realized because they didn't have a lot and they had no idea where this baby was, that they needed the media to try to get out whatever information they could get out.
Barely a mile away, neighbor Rodney Beck may have wondered what all the camera crews were doing down the road, but he didn't have time to check the news when he got home from work. He had more pressing matters to deal with. His wife, Shannon, had just delivered a baby.
Her husband left for work one day, and when he came home, there was the baby.
Like Stephanie Woods, the baby would be Shannon's second, although Shannon's first baby had been stillborn.
The fetus was buried in a little memorial constructed there on the property.
In the 6 years since, the St. Louis native and her husband had resolved to try again. And in the spring of 2006, Shannon told Rodney and her family the good news she was expecting.
I didn't want to jump into it. I waited. And once I made it to a certain point where I felt like I was safe with it is when I told everybody.
Days earlier, Shannon had learned that her sister Maria was also pregnant.
Her due date was literally 2 days at that time before mine, and then later on we were the same date.
It was an amazing coincidence. And as the two pregnancies progressed in tandem, the sisters kept close tabs on how each was doing.
If I had a doctor appointment or she had a doctor appointment, we'd call each other and let us know what was happening.
And by the end of the summer, the entire Torrez family was anxiously awaiting Shannon and Rodney's new arrival.
They fixed up a room for the baby. They decorated it all up, and we'd drive out there and look at it. and check it out.
And we were already buying Christmas presents. I was really looking forward to having my family.
But the wait would be shorter than Shannon imagined. On the morning of September 15th, more than a week before her due date, Shannon started to feel what she believed to be symptoms of false labor.
I kind of felt like I was having somewhat contractions, and I thought they were just Braxton Hicks because they really weren't strong and they really weren't close together.
Instead of calling a doctor, Shannon went about her daily routine.
I walked over to the barn and fed the animals and did all of that.
But by the time she'd finished her chores, according to Shannon, the labor pains she was experiencing were anything but false.
About the time I came back from the barn, I think I was in full-fledged labor and didn't even really know it.
Shannon said she delivered the baby that afternoon at home.
That's all such a really vague memory. I remember coming back to my house and feeling like I was in labor and everything. And then I remember holding my daughter.
It was kind of Shazam. All of a sudden, she had this infant.
But why hadn't she called her husband? Why the surprise? The whole story seemed strange.
He started suspecting something, but, really wasn't certain.
After all, Shannon had gone into premature labor before. Luckily, it seemed there'd been no stillborn this time. Instead, Shannon had a beautiful daughter that she'd named Millie Mae. And while she doted over the newborn, her husband captured the happy moment.
That's my baby.
Shannon claimed the child as her own, but was it? As she put Millie Mae to bed that night, barely a mile away, police were already searching for Stephanie Woods' missing daughter. Although even as they combed the crime scene for clues, investigators were starting to wonder, did the mysterious knife-wielding kidnapper even exist?
You're trained that in these type cases, family members are usually your first suspect that you look at, which is what we did.
Why would someone in the family want to harm the infant? While police couldn't pinpoint a motive, there were aspects of Stephanie's story that weren't adding up.
Stephanie never indicated that this person drove up, that she heard a vehicle, saw a vehicle, or anything like that, which was kind of peculiar.
Being close to a state highway like that, right along a state highway, you would think if somebody's going to abduct a child, they would pull in, do the abduction, and then they would leave.
Was Stephanie covering for someone? Or was her whole story of being attacked, tied to a chair and stabbed, simply made up, right down to self-inflicted wounds to add credence to her story? After all, Stephanie certainly wouldn't be the first mother who faked an abduction to cover something far worse.
They continued on the path that she may have been the person who did this to her daughter. And so that didn't entirely rule her out.
Questioning Stephanie further would have to wait, however. She was still recovering from surgery. That evening, investigators turned to her family instead.
It was traumatic for everybody, and law enforcement is supposed to be there to help, but then we have to ask questions that are kind of incriminating, or leading towards the family, and that's really tough to deal with, but it has to be done.
Stephanie's family, however, didn't hesitate to cooperate.
They wanted to know what happened that day and everything. I talked to them whenever they wanted me to.
Usually when you start to ask those type questions, it's, we've got an attorney, we're not talking to you anymore. But they told us whatever you need to do, do it.
James even volunteered to take a polygraph.
When you asked him, he readily said, yes, I'll take it.
The test cleared James. But what about Stephanie?
We couldn't really give her a polygraph. She had the injuries and was in the hospital and really in no shape for that.
In the meantime, all Stephanie could do was wait.
At that point, they still were kind of targeting me. So I don't think that they wanted to give me too much of an insight on where they were leading.
While Stephanie waited, the authorities scoured the woods around the crime scene. And it wasn't long before the search started paying off.
A couple hours after we got on scene, we did locate a knife in close proximity to the scene.
But did that prove Stephanie's story of a knife-wielding attacker? The investigators, at that point, couldn't be certain.
Maybe it might have been placed there as a diversion to keep us out of another area.
By Saturday morning, the search had intensified.
The Missouri National Guard company out of St. Clair was mobilized, and they did a field grid search of all of the rural areas around the house.
We stood next to each other with about 3 feet between each other and just walked a straight line at a real slow, deliberate pace, scanning the ground, looking for any evidence.
Stephanie's family also called in reinforcements.
Members of the extended family were out everywhere. They were making flyers of the baby, sitting on street corners, passing them out to cars as they went by.
But as Saturday passed, and then Sunday, with no new information about baby Abby, her family struggled to maintain optimism.
Family's in agony. The family's trying to be there for Stephanie. We're wondering what could happen to our Abby.
I thought this woman got Abby in a car and started driving and we would never see her again.
Authorities were doing everything they could to make sure that didn't happen. By the end of the weekend, baby Abby's image was everywhere, broadcast 24/7 by the national media.
We were putting all the information out as quickly as possible and getting the story out on the air.
You literally hope and pray that someone passed by, saw something, heard something, knew something, and would call in.
Coming up, the fateful phone call finally comes.
He said, I got to talk to you right away, and I could tell through his voice that something was wrong.
But had it come in time?
The sheriff asked to see us four alone. He didn't sound too confident.
I feared the worst at that point.
By Tuesday morning, September 19th, 2006, it had been 4 days since a stranger had abducted week-old Abby Woods.
People across the whole United States of America, from Florida to California, were sending cards, they were sending letters, they were sending prayers.
The cards and prayers were little comfort to Stephanie Woods, the missing baby's mother. Released from the hospital, but still a suspect, she'd come home to her parents' house.
I couldn't get her to go to sleep, not even 20 minutes. When she tried to go to sleep, she would wake up in a shock. She would wake up scared and wake up crying and wanting Abby back. She ached for her.
Every few hours, just, where's my baby? I want my baby.
Would Stephanie ever see her child alive again? The investigators were starting to lose hope. That afternoon, in a field not far from the Woods house, searchers had found an ominous clue, an infant's onesie.
Major Copeland called me on my cell phone, and he said, I got to talk to you right away, and I could tell through his voice that something was wrong. That was good news that we found it. The bad news was it had blood on it.
Everyone feared that something had happened to this child, that perhaps it was dead.
Even more troubling to the investigators was where the search team had found the onesie.
There were two ponds in pretty close proximity to the residence, and we were thinking, well, maybe that was a diversion by whoever did this, and, baby may be in a pond. And
Sheriff Tolke called in a dive team to search the pond. Then he contacted baby Abby's family.
The sheriff had called me, and he asked to see us alone. The only thing I can tell you is that I began praying, because he didn't sound too confident.
Considering his urgency to need to talk to us that day, I feared the worst at that point.
The mood was grim that evening as Sheriff Tolke sat down with Abby's parents and grandparents.
Obviously, they were very upset. They knew, too, that this wasn't a very good sign.
But just as Abby's family braced for the worst, the sheriff's cell phone rang.
He turned the phone off, and it rang again, and he kept turning the ringer off, and it was persistent, so he said, I gotta take this.
The call only lasted a few seconds.
And it was the answer we needed. It was Abigail.
They're telling me the baby's alive. And you're going down and you go back up again. And
he started crying. Big old Sheriff Tolke started crying. I mean, his heart was in this just as much as everybody's heart was into finding baby Abby alive.
The tears spread around the room.
We didn't know how to handle the good news. It was the news we wanted, but we still didn't know how to handle it.
It's the most wonderful news in the world. And you're overwhelmed. You don't know what to do.
The news was the culmination of a chain of events that had started with another phone call more than 48 hours earlier. On Sunday, while police, guardsmen, and volunteers continued to scour the Missouri countryside for baby Abby, Shannon Torrez placed a call to her sister-in-law Dorothy in St. Louis.
Shannon called her sister-in-law, said she had had a baby, and the sister-in-law finally convinced her to go to the doctor with this baby and get it checked out.
Shannon had also asked her sister-in-law for a ride. So on Tuesday morning, Dorothy Torrez had driven out to Shannon's house in Franklin County. As soon as she'd arrived at the farm, however, Dorothy had become suspicious.
The sister-in-law realized there that this baby had makeup on her forehead.
She had been listening to the media and was aware of Abigail's disappearance, and she kind of started putting two and two together.
Shannon's husband, Rodney, by then had also heard the media reports.
Shannon's husband had kind of wondered, he thought that the birth was odd, and obviously he knew how close the abduction was.
Could Shannon be the kidnapper that was all over the news? Unsure of what to do, Dorothy drove her sister-in-law to the hospital.
When they got to the hospital, Shannon went inside.
Alone with the infant, Dorothy seized an opportunity. She wiped the makeup off her forehead and discovered a familiar-looking strawberry birthmark.
She realized this was this baby that was all over the news and people were searching for.
When Shannon returned a few minutes later, Dorothy confronted her. At first, Shannon denied Dorothy's accusation.
I think in her mind, this was real. This was the baby that God had given her.
Pressed by Dorothy, however, Shannon admitted the baby wasn't hers, but she denied being Stephanie's attacker.
Her comment was that she found Abby in a ditch.
First thing you want to do is believe her, because maybe this lady left the baby at the side of the road.
Whether Shannon had abducted Abby or not, one thing was clear: the baby had to be returned. That afternoon, Dorothy had left the baby with Shannon, but she had started making calls, filling in the rest of the family.
We were just sitting watching television, and Maria, my other daughter, had called and said, Mom, are you watching television? I said, yes, we are. She said, Mom, that's Shannon. She says, Mom, Shannon has that baby.
Soon, the Torrez family had formulated a plan. That afternoon, they'd contacted the authorities.
The concern of the Torrez family was getting this baby safely back to her family.
There was a real fear once they realized that that baby did not belong to her, that if somebody confronted her, something would happen.
So with authorities alerted, the Torrez family and Shannon's husband, Rodney, prepared to abduct baby Abby again.
Rodney and I walked in, we talked nonchalant, then we went up to look at the baby, and he held the baby, and then within just a matter of moments, it was like, okay, I need to take the baby.
They were able to get this baby away from Shannon Torrez and into the arms of the sister-in-law.
And once Dorothy had baby Abby in her arms, she whisked the infant into a waiting car. Shannon hadn't put up a fight.
She knew the baby needed to go back. She was very remorseful about what had happened, and she really didn't feel like she wanted to go on in this life anymore.
While Shannon struggled with what had happened, her family's thoughts turned to the other baby, the one that Shannon had carried for the last 9 months.
We knew that there was a baby, and we wanted to know what happened to that baby.
While the mystery of Shannon's baby remained unsolved, baby Abby had been found. That evening, she was rushed to a roadside rendezvous with the authorities.
The lady in the passenger side got out, cradling a child. I immediately approached the lady, asked her if this was baby Abby. She said yes.
Baby Abby was in safe hands, and it was at that moment that Sheriff Tolke's cell phone rang, interrupting his tense meeting with Abby's parents and grandparents.
To get a call out of the clear blue like that, that was quite an experience.
Less than half an hour later, Abby and her mother were reunited at a nearby hospital.
They wouldn't just turn her over. They had to make sure that she was okay, but they let Steph be in the room with her.
I had to see her. I had to touch her.
Stephanie Woods was finally able to do the one thing she'd spent almost 5 agonizing days aching to do: cradle her child.
We were escorted into the emergency room, and there Stephanie was holding her, and James was sitting right next to her. The baby looked just perfect, just perfect.
She was in extremely good health. There was no indication of any abuse or malnutrition or anything like that.
For Stephanie, James, and Abby, the ordeal was over. But for Shannon Torrez, it had barely begun. As baby Abby was being reunited with her parents, a small force of Franklin County deputies descended upon the Torrez farm. They found Shannon and the rest of the Torrez family ready and waiting.
A family friend was an attorney, so she had an attorney immediately. She had an attorney before we even got there. So there was no questioning of her or anything like that after she had been taken into custody because she had invoked her rights.
There was no struggle, only tears.
She was sobbing, just out of control, crying, what have you. Her husband was there with her. He was attempting to console her.
It's more of just kind of a flash memory of knowing that one minute I was at home and then the next minute I'm in jail.
With Shannon in custody, investigators on the scene search for answers. What would drive Shannon Torrez, a woman with no history of violence, to commit such an unthinkable crime? That's when Shannon's family informed police of both the loss of her first child and her recent pregnancy.
We believe that Shannon Torrez had suffered a miscarriage and didn't want to tell her family that she had had a stillborn and went looking for a baby to replace the one she had lost.
But what had become of the stillborn?
It was an extensive search of the property and an area around there looking for this second baby, but it was never found.
Shannon wouldn't say what had happened to her infant either. Heeding advice from her attorney, she refused to speak. And at her arraignment 2 days later on September 21st, she maintained her silence.
She came in shackled, orange jumpsuit, very wild-eyed, kind of looking like she wasn't aware of her surroundings. She had been crying. She cried throughout the hearing.
The hearing was brief. The list of charges wasn't.
We charged her with burglary, several kidnapping, stealing. I believe it was 11 or 13 counts.
The prosecutors hit her with everything they could.
And how did Shannon respond to the many charges against her? Not guilty to all of them. Coming up, breaking silence for the first time, Shannon tells her side of the story.
I remember questioning, is this my baby? Is this the baby they're looking for?
On May 9, 2008, Shannon Torrez once again stood in a Missouri courtroom. It had been almost 2 years since she had entered a not guilty plea for the kidnapping of 1-week-old Abby Woods.
There were negotiations and evaluations on mental capacity and whether or not she was able to stand trial, and that really did slow things up and took time.
In the end, the evaluations didn't matter. When Shannon arrived in court that morning, it wasn't to stand trial. It was to change her plea.
She made what is called an Alford plea, where she pled guilty, but she did not admit guilt.
I could have tried to see what a jury would give me, or we could just take what evidence was there and accept the fact that even though I don't remember doing this, that I obviously was involved in it.
With the evidence stacked against her, why wouldn't Shannon acknowledge her guilt? It was simple. She claimed to have no clear memory of the more than 72 hours she'd called baby Abby her own.
I try to look back and try to think of, remember bits and pieces of the day, or I should say the days, and I just can't seem to grab hold of it.
Shannon claimed her memory wasn't clear, but her victim would never forget the traumatic events of September 15, 2006. Stephanie Woods was able to positively identify Shannon as her attacker. And since baby Abby had been found in Shannon's possession, there was no denying what she'd done.
I accept the fact that even though I don't remember doing this, that I obviously was involved in it.
And now she would face a judge to determine her final sentence, which could be anywhere from 10 to 30 years in prison.
I was afraid of what was going to happen because either direction I knew that there was an outcome that could change my life dramatically.
On September 21st, 2008, Shannon's sentencing hearing began. Prosecutor Robert Parks opened the hearing by requesting Shannon receive the maximum penalty allowed under law.
We wanted to make sure that Shannon Torrez stayed in prison until Abby had reached majority.
To back up his request, Parks pointed to several factors. First, there was the premeditated nature of the crime.
She'd planned this out. You know, she brought weapons with her. She brought a knife and a gun.
And the prosecutor added, it was a miracle Shannon didn't face murder charges.
We are very lucky that Stephanie wasn't killed.
That did not mean Stephanie had escaped unharmed, however. The entire family, according to the prosecutor, would carry the physical and mental scars of Shannon's actions for the rest of their lives.
Bob Parks talked about how the Oceanbine Woods family really lived in fear of this woman coming back and coming near their child again.
Let's just say that she got 10 years. Abby would only be 12 years old. Hard to be able to protect herself.
To underscore that fear, Parks called Stephanie to the stand. As she gave her victim's impact statement to the court, she faced Shannon for the first time since the attack. And this time, it was Stephanie who had the upper hand.
I had so many things that I'd wanted to say directly to her, or I guess at her. It really just all kind of spilled out.
Stephanie Oceanbine asked the court for no mercy on Shannon Torrez because they contended that Shannon Torrez showed no mercy when she left Stephanie for dead.
But that, according to Stephanie, wasn't the worst thing Shannon had done.
This woman had made her feel like she would not be able to protect her children. And that was, she said, from woman to woman, you shouldn't have done this to me. She made it very clear that she felt very betrayed by another woman.
But the question everyone wanted to know the answer to was what had driven Shannon to attack Stephanie and steal her baby. The answer, when the defense presented her case to the judge, was that Shannon also knew what it was like to lose a child. Shannon's lawyer reminded the judge that not only had she lost a baby years earlier, she had delivered a second stillborn child shortly before Abby's abduction.
Her lawyers argued at the sentencing hearing that she had been pregnant.
But was she really pregnant? According to the testimony of several witnesses, yes.
We all knew that there was a baby. We felt it. We'd seen all the telltale signs of her being pregnant.
Some people, her priest remembers putting her hand on Shannon Torres's stomach and remembers the baby kicking.
There was nothing that I can remember that gave me any signs that something was wrong.
But Shannon's pregnancy had come to a sudden, devastating end.
She'd suffered a second miscarriage. She wanted children, and she just wasn't thinking clearly, and something just snapped.
And the miscarriage, the defense claimed, had sent Shannon on a desperate search for another newborn.
Psychologists testified to the fact that she was suffering from a postpartum bipolar disorder.
In her mind, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She wanted a baby.
And she'd spent the remainder of the weekend struggling with denial.
I had the back and forth battle in my head of, is this my baby? Is this, you know, is this not? Is this the baby they're looking for?
It's my baby.
There was, however, one problem with the defense's claim. While a medical exam conducted after her arrest concluded she'd recently been pregnant, the defense could produce no evidence of a miscarriage or stillborn.
What we did not know is what had happened to the second child.
But in his closing argument, prosecutor Robert Parks didn't even bother to debate the question. Whether or not Shannon suffered a miscarriage was irrelevant as far as he was concerned. Instead, he asked the judge to focus on the things Shannon had already admitted doing.
One thing the prosecution did make clear is the fact that no matter what her mental state was, it was not excusable for her to go in, slash a woman's throat, and steal her infant baby.
Now, only one question remained. What would the judge's sentence be? Shannon faced as few as 10 years, but prosecutors asked for the maximum of 30.
I always expected that there was going to be some sort of punishment, but I hoped for the best, not for the worst.
She would be disappointed.
Without a blink, the judge slammed his gavel and he said 30 years.
Abby's family was elated.
The way she did this, she was very violent, and it was wrong. And she got the 30 years that she deserved.
Meanwhile, the Torrez family struggled to deal with the loss.
For him to come down with 30 years, I think that's what blew us all away.
Today, Shannon is in prison, serving 30 years for a crime she still maintains she can't remember.
I really don't have an explanation to her as much as I really would want her to know that I was sorry for anything that she ever had to go through.
Stephanie likewise still has trouble coming to grips with what happened that September afternoon.
Because of Shannon and what she had done to me, I can understand the loss of a baby. And I can understand the want for a baby. But I don't think I'll ever be able to wrap my mind completely around why would she want to put any other human being through that pain.
Stephanie not only understands the pain of losing a child, she also knows the joy of getting one back.
When she's old enough to understand, James and I will tell her, okay, look, this is how much we wanted you. We fought this hard to get you back.